We've got a number of you here, so I'll keep admitting people as they come in, but why don't we go ahead and get started in the interest of time. First off, I wanted to introduce Leslie Met to all of the group that haven't already met her. She's going to be she is our interim museum director for the time being, and is now the head honcho of all things museum. If you have any questions or problems, you can all refer them to her now. I'll let her introduce herself, and then we'll go on to Melanie and get the training started. Leslie, you're still muted.
I have a bad habit of doing that. Sorry. Bad Zoom etiquette. Good morning, everyone. I think I've met a few of you, but I'm happy to meet the rest of you, even online. I look forward to meeting you all in person. As Kate mentioned, my name is Leslie Met. I am the interim director here at the museum, a position which I actually held about 10 years ago when they were also in between leadership at the museum. So I'm happy to be back. I have a background in Jewish communal service and nonprofit management. I've worked in the Jewish and non-Jewish world for 20 years, which sounds kind of weird, over 20 years, which sounds kind of weird to say these days, but I'm looking forward to working with all of you. I know you are in excellent hands with Kate and Melanie. We're excited to have you here today for the training. And as Kate mentioned, if there's anything, any concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out. We always appreciate positive and good feedback too. And I look forward to working with all of you. So thank you.
Alrighty, thank you, Leslie. So now we're going to turn it over to Melanie. I don't know how many of you have met her yet. Melanie used to work with me at the Institute of Texan Cultures in their education department. She just started this week at the Briscoe Museum, running up their education department. She's still helping us with a few projects here in her evenings and weekends, and this project here today of running this training session. So if you have any questions for her, you can still send her an email at that contractor email address that I shared with you earlier. And you can also send anything to me and or Leslie, and we can pass it along and we'll get you the answers that you're looking for. So today, Melanie's going to go over sort of some basics for leading a tour, not specifically about the Holocaust, but tours in general, how to keep groups engaged with what you're saying, making sure that what you're talking about kind of stays on track with what we need you to communicate, and all sorts of other good things about leading tours. So Melanie, I'll turn it over to you and you can go from there.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Kate. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'm gonna get I have a little PowerPoint for us all. There we go. All right, can everyone see the PowerPoint and hear me okay? Awesome, thank you. Perfect. All right. Well, as Kate said, today I'm going to be going over how to manage and engage student groups. So really kind of touching on the general, what I feel are kind of overall basics, and talking about things that I have learned throughout my time working with students and groups as well. I realized that some of what I will be talking about may not pertain exactly to the tours that you all will do at the Holocaust Museum, but I still wanted to include kind of as much as I could, just because I feel like it's good for everyone to at least know and be aware of options and things that could happen, and maybe give you all just more tips and tricks to have in your interpreter and tour leader little satchel, little bag there as well. So I wanted to get started with just a background on myself, just to let you all know like who I am and why I might be qualified to lead this training with you all. I worked at the Paul Revere House up in Boston, Massachusetts from part-time 2006, 2007, and then hired full-time 2008 to 2016. And that was when I got the bulk of my working with the public. So I interacted with the public on almost a daily basis and was in the education department, running school groups and school tours, dealing with tourists from all over the world, all over the country as well. Some of the challenges we had at the Revere House that kind of apply a little bit to the Holocaust Museum was It was a small historic house. So it was built in 1680, had 4 rooms, and there was no elevator to get up to the second floor. So people in wheelchairs or with mobility issues just were not able to go up and see the second floor. So we had to figure out a way to let them know the tour, what was on the second floor. We had a little binder with pictures. We had no public restroom, which was kind of a big deal. So we had to deal with redirecting people and telling school groups they just had to hold it till we got to another location as well. And then because it was a historic building, we weren't going to add an elevator to it. And we're in the north end of Boston, squeezed in between other buildings. So no room for expansion. And come May, right around this time, generally, pre-COVID, there'd be a mixing of tourists and school groups, which was always very interesting. So we would get large cruise ships that would come into the Boston Harbor, dropping off boatloads of people, which was great. But we'd also have a lot of school groups coming in. And so we'd have to manage classes amongst tourists who maybe weren't expecting to run into a group of 30 kids on their tour as well. And we had no dedicated classroom space. So we would often be doing programs outside in our courtyard. One of our programs involved going through the house, but then also leading the kids through the city streets of Boston. And we would end up at a burial ground, at Cops Hill Burial Ground as well. But because we were on this tourist trail, we did get a lot of tourists, and we did have higher attendance than most historic houses. And the curriculum was pretty easy. Colonial history, American colonial history was easy to fit into the Massachusetts curriculum. So then I moved to San Antonio, and I came to the Institute of Texan Cultures, where it was kind of the opposite. So we had lots of space. We had a really big indoor center. I'm sure many of you went and watched the Dome show. So we had lots of space. We had bus parking, which was amazing. We had outdoor space for lunches, indoor space for lunches. And we also had restrooms, which I was so excited about. So I'll talk about what Maslow's hierarchy is in just a little bit, but we could take care of the needs of all the groups before we got started, which was amazing. Some of the challenges at the Institute of Texan Cultures is that because we did have a lot of space, we did have sometimes we would have multiple schools bring their whole grade with them. And so we would have multiple tour rotating schedules going. So everyone was supposed to follow a certain rotation, certain schedule, but sometimes people would go off schedule, and they would go to different stations than they were supposed to. So there's a little bit of an adaptation needed if someone was in your spot. And then some of our exhibits were outdated, both kind of in content and display and in hands-on material. So you might take your class of 20 students or so and walk up to this wall, and it's just tiny text and photos, and you had to interpret that and make it student friendly as well. So that was a little bit of a challenge. And sometimes some of the history of the groups and the exhibit floor ended right at 1968. So it wasn't necessarily as modern as you might want as well. So I've worked in kind of different spots, both large and small, and that is what I am bringing to this training. All right. So I wanted to start with just what is interpretation, right? So what are we doing when we're working with school groups? So you might say that I'm an interpreter to someone, general public, and they might think that you talk in different languages, right? You're translating things and you're interpreting, but interpretation is a whole field. And I recommend the National Association for Interpretation for their website for really great resources, really great tips. They often will follow the National Park Service interpretation guidelines as well. So they seem very similar, but I use them for kind of a general definition of what interpretation is, what we're doing. So it's mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections with the interests of the audience and the meanings inherent in the resource. So my kind of, I would say kind of like elevator speech of what interpretation is ideally with students, families, anyone, tourists, anyone you're dealing with, you want to spark something. So you want to spark something within, and I guess you could have a debate whether you want to do, you know, emotional, intellectual first, kind of like what will be the biggest interest or draw, right? So if you connect with a student in an emotional or with their heart level, then maybe they will be more engaged intellectually and they will be more engaged with their tour. So sparking both the head and the heart to get them to become engaged. And this is great. You know, ideally you want them obviously engaged during your tour. You want them engaged with what you're saying during your tour, but you do want them maybe to go home and talk with their families. You know, we definitely had some students that would bring their families to our family days at the Institute because they had just stopped by on a field trip and we told them what was going on. They didn't have a chance to see everything, you know, and they brought their family back with them. They told their family they wanted to visit the Institute of Texts and Cultures during a programming event. So hopefully, you know, even if the students are younger, they can still go back home and tell their parents what they did and get parents perhaps engaged in programming as well. So you want to get their attention during the tour, but then perhaps spark that interest that they'll leave the museum with, and maybe they'll do their own research, or maybe they'll go back to the classroom and ask their teacher more questions, and then again, take it home and hopefully come back for more programming or at least just be more interested in and know the museum is there and see what they have to offer. So interpretation for the 21st century has some little tidbits here. Again, kind of spark that interest. And usually the easiest way to do this is to relate the subject matter to the lives of the visitors. And you want to inspire and provoke people to broaden their horizons. And I realize that with the Holocaust themes and you know, talking about the Holocaust, you're not necessarily going to be able to relate you know, students' lives to the Holocaust and material. But you know, as I've been, you know, as I was an education consultant with the Holocaust Museum, I realized there are certain things within the themes, perhaps, of the tours that you can relate to students' lives. So you know, perhaps bring up the empathy, persecution, you know, and bullying, the anti-bullying, being an upstander. So while you can't necessarily relate everything that the students are going to be talking about when they're with you, you can pick out little bits that perhaps do apply to the students' lives as well. And you never know, you never know quite what students are going to be bringing with them as well. I had a really powerful connection with students that kind of happened out of nowhere. I knew this group was coming to the Institute of Texts and Cultures. I knew they were coming, and it was a school that received recent immigrants and recent families that had just come to the United States. We were in the Lebanese section, which is, it's interesting, but you know, it's kind of, you know, we're talking about 1900s, and it's, you know, sometimes students have trouble engaging, but I talked about how immigrants from Lebanon were coming to the US to avoid being drafted and avoid going to war. And so some of these students raised their hands and said, oh, that's why I left my country, because I was fleeing a war. You know, so you never know really what these students might be bringing with them, what their stories and lives might be like. So you might have students in your group that have had, you know, have fled a country because of war or conflict or something of that nature as well. And then the last one, you'll hear me talk about this a lot kind of throughout, quantity and quality. So this is where I would say tour prep comes into the picture, into play. So really, you know, being an interpreter, leading a tour, leading a school group, it does take practice. It does take, you know, it is it is an art form in a way to be able to engage with a school that you meet, right, you know, meet on the day of, and get them to work with you and have a kind of connection with them. So I would say definitely, I know looking through the Holocaust handbook, they do have you watch multiple people do tours, and then you have to practice. And I think that's a great idea. Usually with my tours, I get the script or get the outline of what I'm supposed to talk about, and then I write it out in my own words, and then I practice saying it loud just by myself, and then I practice saying it in front of people. And so tour preparation is really key, just so you can flesh out your themes, flesh out kind of the order of how you want to talk about things, and introduce maybe topics and definitions. And that will help you create the most kind of concise tour possible. All right, let's see. Any questions or thoughts about interpretation? Anything? You're good? Okay, great. Oh yeah, and so here's our kind of interpretation. I've talked about this a little bit already. So organized has an intro, body, conclusion. Again, this is all kind of going back to the tour preparation. Interpretation is relevant. So again, even though we're talking about the Holocaust, you're talking about something that happened in the past. Again, there are ways with, again, perhaps empathy, persecution, bullying, and to talk about it being upstander, to bring it into the present. So we'll have a more of a connection to that spark, that heart or emotional and intellectual connection with your students. And thematic. So I know, you know, the Holocaust Museum does have themes in its exhibit, and a good tour will often have themes within it as well to kind of help you keep your place and help you know where to go and how to structure your tour. So you want it to have that intro, body, and conclusion, and then within that, you'll have your different themes that you want to be talking about as well. Yeah. And then tangibles and intangibles, again, are kind of emotion and intellect. So things that you can see and touch and experience with your senses, and then the intangibles are things that you feel. So things that you know, everyone may feel, but they may feel them differently, or they may react to them differently as well. And then the last one has a purpose. So just make sure you're meeting the mission and goals of the museum. So that's pretty self-explanatory. All right. All right, let's get into leading the tour, managing the tour. And then after that, I'm going to talk about engaging the students. So we'll start with managing and then engaging. Something that I had to get used to and really kind of learn and develop was realizing that you are in charge when the school comes to the museum, right? So it's an interesting little dynamic. It's an interesting dynamic between you, the tour leader, and this, you know, the program leader at the museum, and then the teacher as well, right? But you initially, once the school gets to the museum, you are in charge. You know where things are. You know the schedule. You know where to take students. You know the rules of the museum. You know different rooms you can use. So teachers may have been to your, you know, hopefully you'll have repeat teachers. And they may think they know everything, but you know, things change within the year. And so you really just have to be in charge. And this is a great, so you start when they get there, during your intro, or as the students are checking in, or as a teacher is paying, get a little bit acquainted with the group. So that means finding out, you know, their grade level. Hopefully you know some of this beforehand, but you know, their grade level, where they're coming from, you know, so that helps if they're coming from far away. Maybe they've just been on a bus for an hour and they had to get up early and they had to leave early, and they get off the bus, you know, and that may be why they're like super wiggly or super kind of like, you know, they may have to release a little energy before they can settle down again. And so it helps to know if they've just been on a bus for a long time, or if it was a, you know, local trip, maybe. And then you can always ask students if they've been here before, if they knew about, you know, where they were, you know, about the Holocaust Museum, if it existed. Also, make sure you identify the teacher, because sometimes teachers will blend in with the chaperones. So make sure you identify the teacher, find out their name, introduce yourself, and maybe describe a little bit of what the group will be doing to the teacher as well. And then during kind of your intro and getting acquainted, it's really good if you have time and you can to see what topics they have been able to cover, because field trips often get scheduled, you know, way in advance. And maybe they schedule this field trip in the fall and they're now coming to see you in the spring. And, you know, ideally they will have progressed to the World War II and the Holocaust history, but maybe things have happened and they haven't. So it's really good to check and see if they have, you know, if they've started, maybe they've just begun their World War II section, and maybe they've just started talking about it. Maybe they haven't at all, you know, and that it is what it is. And so if they haven't started talking about the World War II or the Holocaust, then you kind of have to, on the spot, make a little adjustment to your presentation. So realize that they're not going to be able to answer, if you ask them questions about definitions or events, they're just going to stare at you blankly and they're not going to be able to answer any of those items. So I always, in my mind, I think to myself, okay, I have to switch to more of a storytelling presentation. So ideally, you are telling a story, whether they know info or they don't, but if they don't have any background, if they haven't reached it yet, then you're maybe their first introduction to it all. And so instead of maybe asking about definitions or asking about, specific events, you can ask them more of get more into details of like maybe using pictures or photos, and I know there's some good ones in the exhibit and say, oh, what do you think what's happening in this picture? What's happening? Asking kind of more general questions that students can answer without any background info. So, oh, what do you think is happening in this picture? What do you think they're feeling? What do you think it means? And that way students can answer without having the background knowledge as well. I always say, don't hesitate to ask the teacher and chaperones to help you control the group. So, you might think, teacher will be in teacher mode, hopefully. Very rarely I have a teacher who's kind of in vacation or like field trip mode. Very rarely I've had a teacher, once I've started my group, they will take their phone and they leave and I never see them again. That's not ideal. You don't want that to happen. But most teachers are are still in teacher mode. They're still engaged, and don't hesitate to ask them, because again, you're in charge. You know what you need. So you can ask the teacher to help you control the group or help move the group. And chaperones can be tricky. They're there to help, but they may not have received any info about what's going on. So they may not know what to do. So they're just, kind of hanging about. So don't be afraid to assign roles or tasks to a chaperone. You can ask them to maybe help if you have anything to hand out. You can, ask them to help you hand things out. If you have a particularly rowdy group or rowdy student, maybe you can ask a chaperone, oh, do you mind just standing right by this student here? And usually that is good to help, usually having an adult stand by a student will help them, calm down a little and center in a little bit, focus them a little bit. So you can ask them to kind of help you with students if you want. Sometimes, especially with younger classes, teachers will have those little sayings to get classes' attention. Sometimes they might say, like 1, 2, 3, and then students will say, eyes on you, or something, so you can see ahead of time if teachers have a way to do that. And you can try. I sometimes don't have the most luck with that, but you can try using ways that teachers use in their classrooms to get their students' attentions as you go. And it's always good within kind of the intro bit and as you get started to remind students and chaperones about museum manners. So sometimes, again, students get off the bus, they're in a new location, and they're just they're super excited. It might be especially, school groups and tours, they often happen at the end of the year. So, you're getting close to the end of the school year and it's just like energy levels are like, whoa. So it's always good to kind of center your students, remind them to remember museum manners and that they're still in school, they're still with their school, they're still representing their school, and that they still need to follow school rules. And then, and it might vary within classrooms. So I always just like to tell students how I want them to act when they're with me. So I want them to be interested. I want them to raise their hands if they have thoughts or questions. But I always like to say, raise your hand. So just kind of to get that out of the way. And then if you need to repeat it, then you'll be repeating it. It's a good time to remind chaperones about cell phones. I'm not sure exactly what the usage policy is at the museum, but if it's no cell phones, then say, please turn your cell phones off right now. And just, remind them as well, because chaperones also can be in tourist mode, and they're often with their child. And so they are going to want to maybe be documenting things. So, so just kind of lay down the groundwork, lay the rules, what you want them to do. And again, tell them where they should sit, where they should stand, what you need them to do. At the ITC, we had a limited number of benches. So I always said, students sit on the floor, adults will sit on the benches. And I always think students would love to sit on the floor. I had no problem, but there was more trouble just getting students to sit on the floor. They all wanted to sit on the benches. I don't know. But so definitely just keep reminding them, figure out how you want, where you want the adults and chaperones to be and where you want students to be, and kind of direct them as well. All right. Now this one, I know you guys don't necessarily move your groups a lot, but I just wanted to put this in there in case the tour rotation might change eventually. And again, just kind of get these ideas in your head, so you can be thinking about them and have them in your wheelhouse as well. So
this is a goal, everyone. We've been moving them for you, but the goal is that you will move them and then you will take them to the next activity and you'll lead the next activity. So if you start out in the museum giving the general tour, then you'll take them to the activity session and then you'll lead the activity session. So this is a little preview.
Excellent. Yes. So that's, again, put these thoughts in your little interpreter satchel there and take it with you if it happens. So, you know, moving the group seems pretty basic, right? I'm just going to lead my group, but all sorts of things can happen. So I just, you know, always be in the lead. When I was moving groups, leading students through the streets of Boston, I always, you know, there's always a couple kids who want to like run in front of you, or they're just like right next to you. And so you just make sure you can get them right back to you. And this is a great time to ask a teacher or chaperone to bring out the rear. You say, oh, can you be our caboose and make sure we don't lose anyone and like be the end? And then ask them, you can ask tour teachers and chaperones to open a door. Like, oh, can you open this door and make sure we get everyone from this room? And then again, you might be so excited about what you're talking about that you get your you know, the fast walkers with you to the where you're going, and then you just jump right into your presentation. But it's important to remember to wait for the whole group to gather to you before you start to talk, because you don't want people to be coming back, you know, hanging in the back and they can't hear you, or they realize you've already started and then they check out a little bit. So just make sure that you have everyone in your group with you before you begin to talk. This one was something I had to learn. I'm a pretty fast walker. Younger students have shorter legs, so just make sure you adjust your speed so that you don't lose your group. You don't want to lose your group when you're moving places. And this is also, I mean, this is more relevant in Boston and then in the ITC. Sometimes chaperones will take their kids or their, you know, group that they're with, and they'll just leave the group and start taking pictures somewhere else. They'll like start going on their own little tour. And so it's just kind of a good idea to keep your eye on everyone and just be like, oh, you can take pictures at the end, or we need to stay together. Please come back to the group. So just keeping an eye. There's all sorts of temptations sometimes that will draw chaperones and students away. And then this one, the very last one, oh, and then I use the term friends sometimes with school groups because it's gender neutral and it's easier and it sounds, you know, it's friendly and it's welcoming. So I always say taller friends in the back, shorter friends in front, especially if you're someplace that has kind of limited space. You know, there's a front row, like everyone wants to be in the front row and not everyone can be in the front row. And so that might cause, you know, students start scuffling and pushing and shoving. So you just really have to kind of control where students will stand and make sure that everyone can see, you know, as best as possible what's going on as well. And if people are in the back and they can't see and there's not a lot of space to move, you can always say, I know you might not be able to see, but I'll make sure you take a look at this at the end or something. So you can address it right away so people in the back aren't worried or freaked out that they're missing something. And then splitting up the group, if you need to split up a group, I would say work with the teacher, but I generally recommend don't let the teacher be the only one doing it, because it can take up a large chunk of time to split up a group. So we had a program where we had fifth graders and we would split them up into, you know, different groups to do a little group work. And sometimes, you know, you're limited on your time. You have a lot you want to say, and you don't want to take 5 or 10 minutes to split up a group that then start doing the activity. So I say work with the teacher. You know, we tell them, you know, oh, we need, you know, 5 groups of 4 people. And because sometimes the teachers will know who not to put in a group together and who works well together. But if you just sometimes leave it up to the teacher themselves, they'll be like, oh, well, I don't know. Oh, I don't, you know, they'll start hesitating. And so it takes a long time. And then I'm always really try to be aware, especially sometimes teachers, again, if you leave it up to the teachers, they'll sometimes be like, oh, form your own group, pick your group partners, or something like that. And then people get left out and cliques are starting to form. And so I always try, if you assign the groups, then you can just make sure everyone's included and no one's like left out. So I always try to be aware of that as well. So, yeah. Again, trying to manage your time and make sure you can say everything and get it to everything. So let's move in your group. Let's see. All right, voice level. So this is, again, something that I've been working on myself. So obviously well, maybe not obviously through Zoom, but I have a very loud voice and I can kind of be boisterous at times. So you would think that would be really ideal. Like, oh, I have a loud voice, I'm good to go, that's it, end of story. But just be aware that you can use different voice levels within your presentation. And I highly recommend using different voice levels. And I would, definitely go loud when speaking with a larger group, if you're outside, or if there's a lot of background noise. And maybe, if stuff is going on and it's kind of chaotic, a lot of different sounds, you can always check with the group, like, oh, can you hear me in the back? And, and make sure people can hear you. Because you don't want to be talking and doing your fabulous presentation and only the people in the front can hear you. You want to make sure everyone can hear what you're saying. But I caution against going loud. If you have a rowdy or chatty group, it's very just kind of a natural reaction to go louder as they go louder. And then all of a sudden you're in a shouting match with a group. You don't want to be in a shouting match with the group. It just really usually doesn't work. Sometimes you can use, like, I need your attention, so you can go really loud to try to get their attention and then bring your voice level down. But really, if they're going louder and louder, some tips that sometimes work is that you just stop talking, and ideally the teacher might notice that you have stopped talking, and you might say, I'm going to wait till everyone settles down before I begin. And the teachers hopefully will hear that and help calm the group down and help get the group back into focus and attention. And so that's one of the ways that you can manage your group. I did see, I saw someone use going softer to manage the group as well. So they had their students' attentions, but they were still kind of chatty and still a little bit louder and unfocused. And you can use your voice and go softer. When you're in person, especially, going softer can sometimes get a group's attention as you're going through. But regardless, again, I do recommend kind of adjusting your voice level as you go through, maybe in your telling your doing your presentation or telling your story as well. All right. So schedule or group changes. So this is the portion where I say that flexibility is key when dealing with school groups. And being aware of timing as well. So again, this kind of gets into your tour preparation. So you want to be familiar enough with your tour that you can make adjustments and changes if needed, kind of on the spot, on the fly. And often the adjustments, not very rarely will you need to go longer. Sometimes you do, but most often the adjustments you need to make will be going smaller or making it shorter. So having a shorter presentation as well. And something just to be aware of with groups in general, if you have a small group, typically I find that those go faster. Smaller groups are easier to move. They're easier to manage and get them to settle down and get their attention. And so they usually go a little bit faster. And then again, on the flip side, larger groups, again, will take more time. There's sometimes, it takes longer to move them, takes longer to get their attention. And so just be aware of that when you're doing your tour preparation. So just some things about being flexible. You want to have the school have the best experience possible. And that may start a little rocky. If they are running late or something has happened, they might get to the museum and then you may have to adjust your tour. But I really I don't want anyone to, you know, and it's easy to get kind of stressed out as well. You know, the school is running late, the teacher is stressed out, you know, anxiety levels are high, and you're realizing you have to cut out a bunch of things that you've just, you know, you've worked really hard on your tour presentation, and you have to cut things out. But I really just recommend, don't let yourself get flustered. Again, you're in charge, and anything that the students hear from you is going to be wonderful. You know, even if it's not the full presentation, still the experience of being with you, being at the Holocaust Museum is going to be, is still a great experience, no matter if it's a short amount of time. So don't say, you know, as you go through your tour, oh, I have to skip this section because you guys were late. Or no, we're not gonna be able to talk about that because you all were late. And I have seen people do that. And I'm just like, oh, it just, you know, it doesn't create the best tour. And it's not the student's fault usually that they were late. Something might have happened with the bus or the scheduling. So students won't know what they're missing. Teachers are already stressed out and don't need to be reminded that their field trip is going awry and is not perfect, you know. So just, you know, get into your school group. You're like, okay, we need to, you know, I want to have a lot of things to cover in a short amount of time. So let's get going. But again, don't keep reminding them that they're missing things or everything's messed up because they were late, you know, as well. And then again, you know, you might be halfway through your tour. I've had this happen to me. You know, going through my presentation where, you know, everything seems to be on time and going well. And then the teacher's like, we need to leave in 10 minutes to get to our lunch appointment, you know, or so. And this may not happen to you all at the museum, but things happen. They may let you do. They're like, we have to go in, you know, 10 minutes. And you're like, you still have half your presentation or something to do. So just realize that even if they arrive on time, again, it's that introduction part with them. Just double check, you know, just let them know when the tour is going to go to, you know, like, oh, you're here and we have an hour-long tour and you're supposed to be ending at 11. And just make sure that they know that you're, when the end time is, just to get any kind of schedule mishaps out of the way before you get started. And then, but then sometimes it still happens that the teacher lets you know they need to go. And so then you kind of have to just be like, oh, okay. And you wrap up and then you do the best you can. And again, kind of respect the school schedule, because you do want to try to give the school the best experience they can. And it may not be ideal, but you do need to kind of respect them and don't try to hold them longer. Don't be like, well, I'm just going to do my full talk and I don't really care what's going on with their schedule. Just try to wrap it up and do the best you can as well. And something that I run into, the last bullet point, is that realize that teachers teachers who are on the field trip with your classes may not be the ones who made the reservation. So parents and PTO organizations sometimes make reservations, administrators make reservations, and other teachers who may not even be on the field trip make the reservations. And so you might send you know, pre-visit materials, you might send schedules, you might send all the info you have, all the great tips and tricks of what to do and what to expect to these people who made the reservations, and that info may not have made it to the teachers on the field trip. So you might have, you know, it seems very strange when you walk up to a teacher and they're like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what we're supposed to be doing. I don't even know what our next step is. And so sometimes, again, kind of in the intro part, that's the key, where you're trying to figure out what's going on, figure out how much knowledge the teacher has, and then adjust as needed as well. So, you know, again, teachers are like, oh, I just thought this was going to be a 30-minute visit, and then we're going to go over here and do this or something. So again, really just try to get everyone on the same page as soon as you can, and then it's easier. And again, realize that teachers on the field trip may be totally in the dark about what's going on. And so again, doesn't really do any good to get mad at them or, you know, kind of be angry at them or stressed out. Just kind of be as flexible as you can to kind of go with the flow there. Okay, so here we go, talking about surprise groups, things that might happen. And this could really be its whole presentation on its own. This is kind of this very surface level. So no matter how many times you ask a school if they need any special accommodations and they say, no, we're good, they might show up on the day of the tour with people or students that need special accommodations. And so you just have to, again, be flexible and try to adjust as much as you can ahead of time. And the more familiar familiar you are with your tour, the easier it will be to adjust and go. And again, this is another important part of walking through the tour without any groups, doing the tour in the museum without any school groups. So you can figure out different ways that you can adjust and situate people as needed. So my first kind of surprise group was ESL students. So sometimes, students for whom English is not their first language, sometimes they will be kind of just scattered throughout classes, but sometimes you'll have its own separate class of students who are ESL students. And you might be the tour guide who is going to be working with them. So just realize you have to adjust, and it will take longer to get through your presentation. So you might have to shorten it. Be aware of the words that you're using, and you might have to define even the more basic words that you generally would just take for granted. Speak slower, but not necessarily louder, right? So they can all hear you generally very well, but you just need to speak slower for them. And especially students who are learning will really, and if you've ever been in a situation where you're trying to listen to another language, it always sounds like the other person is speaking so fast. So just really speak slower, make sure to define words. And it's always good to do a check-in just to see if they understand what you're saying and see if they have any questions. If the teacher is bilingual, or a student might be bilingual, you might be able to get them to translate for you, or translate certain sections, or maybe be the translator to ask, questions. But again, that takes more time as well. So, you're talking, and then you have to maybe pause to let the person translate, and then the students have to take time to listen and absorb, and then they have to take time to maybe ask questions, ask the translator, and the translator will ask you. So it all just takes a little bit more time to get going as well. So just go slower and be aware of words that you're using. If you can adjust words and make them a little bit more simple than that, I would suggest doing that as well. And then we have special needs students. Again, special needs students might be scattered throughout different classes, or they might be in one group. So this includes hearing impaired, visually impaired, students with mobility issues, and then cognitive issues as well. So again, this could be a whole separate presentation on your own, and this is very surface level. But just be aware, again, this is another great thing to talk about when you're introducing yourself to the teacher, figuring out if you see a student in a wheelchair, say, oh, I see that you have a student in a wheelchair. Okay, great. And then in your mind, you're thinking about where you can place that student in the room so they can see everything, they have access to everything. And then just know it might take a little bit longer if you're moving the student. They'll have to use the elevator. So you might have a chaperone be like, oh, you're going to go with this student and you're going to use this elevator. Or you might have to call in another staff person to help you with moving the group as well. Sometimes you might have a sign language. If someone is hearing impaired, you might have someone doing sign language. So then you have to adjust where you're standing and have the sign language interpreter be able to see the person they're working with. So again, so you just have to kind of see what they need and try to adjust as much as you can. At the Revere House, we had railings, and only I was supposed to go past the railings. But when we had sign language interpreters, the interpreters would come behind the railings so they could be facing someone. And they might not need a sign language, but they might be able, people may be able to see your mouth. They might read lips or be, so you just have to be, if you are working with students who have hearing impaired, just see how they are able to learn the best and adjust as needed. So you might also need to speak slower. You might need to enunciate things more and make sure you're speaking up. I've also had multiple classes, teachers will ask me to wear a little microphone. And so I think it's the microphone just sits right here, and then you don't have to do anything else. So just make sure you wear the microphone, and then it's somehow translates what you're saying. Broadcast what you're saying to a student's hearing aid. And so sometimes teachers ask you to wear the microphone or pin a microphone. So just be aware of that as well. And again, if you have people in wheelchairs or with mobility issues, again, it's a good idea to have an idea of what your tour route will be, or even just, within the Holocaust Museum, there are the benches. Where's the best place to put someone in a wheelchair that they can still hear and see you as well? If they're visually impaired and you're passing around items, maybe I don't really talk about using objects. I don't think you use objects too much in your tours, but if you are doing something, just make sure, you might have to take a little bit longer to explain something or move around. If a group is visually impaired, it might take them longer to find their seats. It might take them longer to move through the hallways. So just be aware of that as well. One of the programs we did at the Revere House, we had groups, it was a play. And so I would assign roles to the students as we went throughout. And you might see a student who's maybe in a wheelchair or maybe has cognitive issues, and you don't assume that they don't want to be part of the group. So just always, if you are, if they raise their hand, try to call on them and see what happens, and just be flexible that way. Don't try to, don't leave students out. Don't totally just ignore a student because you might assume that they might not be paying attention or engage with the group as well. And sometimes, this is one that it's a little bit tricky sometimes to tell, but if sometimes students have like ADHD, or they have other issues that maybe they're moving around a lot, and ideally you want your group seated and you want them focused on you and paying attention. But usually you can tell they might have an aide, or they might have someone with them. So they might be, they usually have figured out how to be within a group without totally distracting them. So they might be at the back, or they might be on the side, but if you see a student is with an aide or with a teacher's aide, and they're moving around a lot, then they might not be able to sit still, and it doesn't help. It's really going to be distracting and embarrassing for the student if you're calling them out and saying, oh, you need to sit still, please stop moving, please, you're distracting the class, so just be aware if you can kind of tell, sometimes when a student might be moving, and just kind of let them do their thing and have them maybe in the back of the classroom or some back of the room, so they're not disrupting everyone. And sometimes those students are just being extra chatty, or they're being, extra wiggly. And so then you can ask them to kind of, pay attention, bring their focus back to you as well. And again, just be aware that sometimes disabilities don't show. And so you're not going to be able to tell everything. Sometimes, especially this is true when if you ask students to read something out loud, that can be very intense. So maybe you can just ask if you want to get some participation, maybe ask someone just to read one word, or just, something like that. But reading can often be really stressful for students, and you're not sure if they have a reading disability. So I would recommend generally not picking on students, but you can ask for volunteers to read that way as well. And then students that might seem like they're really, have a lot of energy or might be really moving, if you have something going on, you can ask them to help you. So you sometimes can focus that energy. So if you're handing out papers, you can be like, oh, Peter, you can come on up here. You're gonna be my helper. Help me hand out these papers, or help me hand out these pencils or something. So you can get them engaged, and sometimes that will focus their energy as well. Again, in my program, we had some roles that were movement roles. And if I saw a student kind of had a lot of energy or was moving a lot, then I might get them in that role, and that help them focus as well. Okay. We are going to keep moving because we're moving along in our time. But so that was kind of managing groups. I know it's a lot, but we are now going to get into engaging the students, and this is the section where I'm going to talk about questions. So really the best way to engage students is with the questions you ask. So just as being interpreting and working with a school group is an art form, asking questions is an art form. Asking, being able to read your group is an art form. So you want to, again, this is where tour preparation comes along. So you maybe have a variety of questions that you can ask. So some of the, this is the, that's the first thing, variety of questions. So you might, depending on the age of the group, depending on any other kind of, what the group makeup is like, group energy, background info, again, what knowledge they're bringing with them. You might just ask yes or no questions to warm up the group, or raise your hand if you know this, or raise your hand if you've heard about this type of thing. And that's a great way to kind of get students focused on you. Deeper questions, if you're asking those deeper thought type questions, realize you might not get a lot of response back. You might just have a couple students raising their hands as well. Or if you are asking questions and no one is answering, maybe you need to reformulate your questions and go back to kind of asking the bigger group questions as well. Know why you're asking a particular question. Again, making sure you're relating your question back to your themes and back to your tour and back to what you want to ask them. And again, it's because you know so much and you have so much you want to let your students know about. Sometimes it can be easy to start peppering them with questions, and I'm guilty of this too. You know, you're in the flow, you're going, you're talking, you're engaging, you're talking with the students, and you just ask 3 questions in a row, and the students just stare at you because they don't even know where to start. So you just have to be kind of aware of what you're doing. If you ask 3 questions in a row, be like, oh, I'm so sorry, you know, I overwhelmed you with questions, and then just pick one question and just kind of start with that. I always loved, ideally you want your whole group to be, raising their hands and making comments or suggestions and asking questions. Sometimes it can be hard if they're shy or they're, whatever might be happening. So I always try to be as encouraging and welcoming with questions as possible. So I've also seen this happen though, when a tour guide doesn't know what the student's saying or can't hear them, like, I don't know what you're saying, or that's not what I'm talking about. Just try to be understanding of students and don't just shut them down right away. One of the things I like to say is, that's an interesting question. We're going to hold on to that question till the end. And whether you actually answer the question or not, it's fine. I think, if a student is asking a totally bizarre question or out of the blue or, just not related, it's like, hold on to that thought. We'll get to it at the end. And that way, that the student, you didn't totally just shoot down the student, and you can, and hopefully just keep moving on with your tour as well. And also when you start asking questions and students raise their hand, it's a great time to reinforce that. So I ask a question, and especially in the beginning, a student raises their hand, I'm like, that was a great job raising your hand. Thank you so much for raising your hand. And then you get on with the question. So again, it's kind of a great way to reinforce good behavior. At the very bottom there as well, it's also important to wait for students to answer. And this is a really hard one for all of us, I think, because those pauses seem really awkward. But wait, maybe, ideally 3 seconds and count off in your head, 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, to give students time to think about it, process, and then come up with an answer. So it's a good idea. Don't just, ask a question and then jump in and want an answer immediately, but it can be hard. I know it can be hard. And then again, so thinking of the R's, so there's another way to kind of think of things, recognizing the student. So you might have a student, and sometimes you have chaperones who answer all your questions. And at first that's okay, but you don't want the chaperones taking over your group, right? You might have a chaperone who's like really into Holocaust history or really, is really interested. But if that starts to happen, you can always just say, oh, we would love for the students to have a chance to answer these questions, or let's have the students answer these questions, see if the students have any answers, right? So recognizing, I talked about rewarding, like saying, oh, that's a great job raising your hand. But on the other side, if no one is raising their hand, or if just one student is raising their hand, you might work on something to say. And I always like to say, oh, I know, I see you raising your hand a lot. I'm glad you're so interested. But you can just ask, does anyone else have anything to say? Does anyone else, any of your other students or classmates have questions? So just be kind of aware of balancing questions and not letting one student or chaperone take over what's going on. And I know when you're talking about people, giving a presentation and doing public speaking, often the tip is to focus on one person in the audience, right? You like pick one person and focus on that spot. But I encourage you to make eye contact with multiple students. I encourage you to kind of look around the room occasionally. I encourage you to move a little bit from side to side of, when you're in front of the class there. So it really does help if you can, make eye contact, even with the students in the back. They'll be a little bit more engaged with you as well. I encourage you to pick on students from a variety of spots within the group. So don't just focus on students in the front. Make sure you're calling on students who might be raising their hand in the back, calling on a variety of students throughout the group as well. And I have a little thing in here called the shout out questions. So some tour guides like to do this thing where they're like, just shout out the answer to me, shout out, shout it out. I don't necessarily like to do that because it can often descend into chaos very quickly. I just at the end here, I say you need to read your group. But sometimes a group is really well organized and they're really in control of themselves and they do know a lot. And so that, you are able to still control your group while asking for them to shout out. But sometimes it just turns into kids shouting things randomly, interrupting your tour, and just shouting. And I just don't think it's perhaps the best, best thing to do as well. And it can be hard to stop. You might think, oh, I'm just going to ask them to shout out a question or shout out an answer to this one question. But then they're going to keep doing it. They're going to keep thinking that's the way you want them to answer questions. So in general, I go with asking kids to raise their hands as well, just as a way to keep control of the group and just keep things flowing and keep things moving. And when you do, when you ask students for questions, I have on here, restate the question. So a student's going to ask you a question and there's going to be times when you're like, I need you to speak up, please. These students are a little shy and they're nervous. They're asking you a question, but ask them to speak. You can hear the question, but the whole group may not be able to. So when I ask for questions and I get a question from a student, I'm always like, oh, that's a great question. I would say, this student just asked, so restate the question for the whole group to hear you. And then this is also a good time to kind of reformulate the question if you need to, because sometimes you can see what type of question the student's trying to ask, but it might be a little jumbled or might be a little confusing. And so then you can say, I think you're trying to ask this. And the student will be like, yes, yeah. And so then you can restate it so that it is easier to understand as well. And then also on that note, if you're asking a question and no one is answering and you're just getting blank stares, you might need to reformulate or restate your question as well. That takes us into this one. So again, remember the R's. So reformulate the question in a way that the student can recognize. And again, this is, if you're familiar with your tour and you're familiar with the info and the content, you'll be able to adjust and ask questions in a different way as needed. And then realize that some students might be so excited to participate, they raise their hand and then you call on them and they freeze and they don't know what's going on. So and it's always a good time to be like, oh, well, let's just ask your fellow classmates for help, or let's see if anyone else has an answer. So you just kind of keep moving on and don't let it distract you or don't try to force the student to answer. And sometimes it happens that students ask questions that make perfect segues into your next theme or your next topic. So you can use that as well, kind of riff off the question. And it's always great if you can refer back to a question that was asked. So students love that. If you're like, you remember you asked this question, it was a great question. And here we are, here we're going to be talking about it. So, try to kind of remember and retain what questions have been asked as you're going through your tour as well. And then I would say, also sometimes, again, depending on the age group, especially with younger groups, the questions are not going to be that focused. And if you have someone that seems to be asking kind of unfocused questions, you can just feel free to always refocus. Again, this comes back to being familiar with your tour. And it comes back to, again, being like, that's an interesting idea. Hold on to that thought. We'll go back to it later. Or like, that's a great idea. We're not talking about that right now, but we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. And then you can just move on as well. And then be like, okay, so we're going to refocus. If you go off on a little bit of a tangent, that happens sometimes, or students are so excited to share something with you that you kind of go with it for a little bit, but then you're like, okay, guys, we need to refocus. We're going to get back into our, talking about the certain theme that you were talking about. So it's up to you to kind of refocus and put on pause or, postpone questions that might be really distracting. Okay. All right. So I just threw these in here. So, you know, in conclusion, kind of wrapping up, I do realize that the information you're talking about has special considerations and the topics and themes and things. So these were just some of my ideas that I could think of as I was putting this presentation. I mean, obviously, there's always so much information you want to give to the students and you want to share with the students. Just realize you're not usually going to be able to share it all. And I know it's really hard because you're passionate, you want to include everything, but you really just have to, you know, sometimes on a tour, time and schedule takes precedence over everything that you want to share. You know, sometimes readjusting is needed. And if the students, you know, are special needs or ESL, you really just have to boil it down to the basics and realize that that's going to be a great experience for them too, that they don't need to know everything that you're talking about as well. And then, you know, again, just check in. This is just a good idea with anything you're talking about. Check in to make sure students understand the material you're talking about. But I think especially with the Holocaust, there's so many definitions, so much backstory and background. Just kind of make sure and check in with them as you're going along. And this is something I was looking at on the U.S. Holocaust Museum out in DC. You know, obviously, sometimes you might expect students' reactions. They might need time to process the material. So it might be a good idea to encourage time for reflection individually or with a partner. But the Holocaust Museum in DC was suggesting also, they noted that don't be alarmed if students don't have any reaction. You know, so it can be a lot to process. So they might just be kind of basic, just, you know, not showing any sort of emotion or reaction, and don't be too alarmed on that end either. You know, who knows what's going on in a student's mind, really, you know, what they're thinking about and processing about. And it could be something your quietest student goes home and, you know, back in the classroom with their teacher, they have so much to say, or at home with their parent, they'll process what they've talked about, you know, as well. And so usually, kind of to end everything, you know, I always say, you know, a good tour, you know, working with students, you want to bring energy and enthusiasm and excitement and, you know, be really just, you know, really bring that energy and you'll have a really great tour. And I understand with the Holocaust and the material you're talking about, it may not be as appropriate, but I do think that you can still bring passion and genuineness, and you do still want to have some energy as you're interacting with the students as well. You just need to kind of adjust it to fit the material you're talking about as well. But bringing the energy, bringing passion, bringing the idea that you're very genuine and about the topic, the students will be able to pick up on that. They'll be more likely to engage with you and to feel like they can ask you questions. And so that's, I do encourage still bringing that as well. All right. And on that note,
all right, yes.
Thank
you so much, Melanie. We ran over just a little bit.
Sorry, guys. I'm sorry.
But hey, there's a lot to clam in. It's very much like a school tour.
It is. It is. I didn't respect the schedule. No. But yeah.
Demerits for you.
Yeah. I can stay for just a little bit if anyone has any questions or anything. Happy to answer questions. You can, again, like Kate said, you can always email me. I'll send this PowerPoint to Kate so she can share it with you all if you're interested. But yeah.
And then Melanie, I see, did we record the whole session?
We did.
Okay. So I'll have you download that and we'll put it on YouTube and we'll
Perfect.
send out the link to the docents for anyone who didn't catch it live. They can watch the recording. So does anyone have any questions before we call it a day?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah. What if you're asking a question and you're seeking a certain response from the students and the first person that answers doesn't give you the answer you're really looking for? What's the right thing to do at that point? To give others a chance to answer then afterwards, or do you just go answer it yourself? Because I worry sometimes when I let others, and then that student's going to feel bad.
Right, absolutely. No, that's a great question. That's when I like to say, that's a great idea. You know, I like to say like that's a great idea, but let's see if does anyone else have anything they want to share? Or, you know, I like to acknowledge that they, answered it. It might have been kind of where you were going, but not quite. But you can, I always like to say, oh, thank you for answering. That's a great idea. Let's see if anyone else has anything else they want to share about this. And you can re-ask the question, maybe restate the question, maybe reformulate it a little bit as well, and then continue on. Let's see if your classmates have anything else to share as well. I think that's a pretty good way to recognize and acknowledge the student, but then carry on trying to get the answer that you're looking for as well. Sometimes you can, you might have to lead the students a little bit, I don't know, and say, give them little clues about how you want them to answer, what to say, if they're not as responsive as you'd like as well. But yeah, it's because sometimes it will take a couple different students. So you might say, oh, you got this section. So you say, oh, you responded this way, or like you mentioned this. Let's see what else someone else said. Oh, you mentioned this. And then you're like, we're going to put, that's the whole answer I'm looking for type thing, I think. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool.
Liz, did you have a question?
Yeah. Thanks, Melanie. That's helpful. I've forgotten how to talk to people live.
Good. Yeah.
This time. I did have a question going back to the beginning of the presentation. You were talking about pros and cons of different spots that you'd worked. I know this isn't fair because you didn't really get to conduct live tours at our museum, but can you see pros and cons of our museum?
Yeah, well, I know that it is, I've been there for teacher workshops and have been there for presentations and things. So I know that it's more of a lecture style and that you're sitting down, but you do have to be aware if you're going, it's a circular museum. And so if you are pointing at things or referencing things on the wall as you're going around, students are going to have to be, moving, be aware of how you can see things. And, you might have to just be like, okay, we're going to look behind you now, and then pause and let everyone get situated. Or you might say, like, as you move around the room, you might have students shift with you. So, like, oh, we're going to be over in this section, and then have everyone shift to that section. And then, like, keep giving just time. Again, that takes in some time to let people get adjusted and situated as well. I think that would be and be aware of where you're standing, I think, because if you're asking students to look behind them and you don't move, then they will be looking away from you and you'll be behind them, and you'll just be this voice from behind, and you lose a little bit of engagement and a little bit of control that way. So if you're asking students to look one way, I would suggest moving that way and getting in front as well, if that helps. I think that would be, and I think, I'm not sure quite how much space is around the outside. So again, kind of adjusting as needed for special considerations that might be another thing as well, I think, for your location. And again, kind of entering and exiting might be, it's kind of limited. You have a small entrance and exit area. So if you're moving with a big group, that's going to take a little bit of time to get everyone in and settled and then out and gathered in the spot that you want to move them to next.
Does anyone else have a question? Want to raise hands or just speak up?
Yay.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. If something occurs to you later on and you're just not thinking of it right now, feel free to email Melanie or I or Leslie, and we'll get back to you with an answer on that. But thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Melody.
All right. Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.